Ralph Nader. You
Oh,
have an
no, not at
extraordinary...
all.
Okay, okay, guys.
You have...
Okay, guys, let's bring some other people into this discussion.
Well, let me just finish what I'm going to say because it's important. You have an extraordinary career in standing up for the American people. You have saved lives with your extraordinary work with automobile safety. You are responsible for much of the extraordinary environmental work that has been done in this country in the last 40 years. I ask you not to turn your back on your own legacy.
Well, let me just...
A quick response.
Yeah, a quick response. Howard, look, I took you for your word when you were running in the primary, when you called John Kerry another special interest clone in Washington, when you called him turning his back on the American workers, when you called them giving George W. Bush a blank check on the war in Iraq, when you called them as voting for the Leave No Child Behind, which you in significant part opposed, and when you called him the lesser of two evils. Now, let's get it over with. The issue here is the corporate domination of our country that has prevented electoral reform that would have eliminated your objectives like instant runoff voting, proportional representation, public funding of public campaigns, same-day voter registration, and making every vote count with a paper trail by these Diebold-produced voting machines.
Now
let's focus on the corporation.
Now we're going to go into some of those issues and voting reforms in a minute, but first you're listening to NPR's Justice Talking, where Howard Dean and Ralph Nader are sparring on the role of third parties and other issues. Let's take some questions from our audience.
My name is Nick, and I'm from Washington, D.C. Regardless of how anyone feels about what the Supreme Court's ruling in Bush v. Gore enabled in terms of who gained access to the presidency, its language affirms that Article I, Section 2 of the Constitution puts the ultimate power to determine the electors in a national election in the hands of the state legislatures. And I'm interested to hear from both of you gentlemen what position, if any, you take on the adoption of a constitutional amendment positively asserting the unambiguous right of American voters to choose their electors in national elections.
Who wants to take that first? Howard?
I think we need complete electoral reform. I think we need, first of all, that Jesse Jackson Jr.'s constitutional amendment giving Americans the right to vote ought to be passed so that the right wing of the Republican Party cannot, as they did in 2000, disenfranchise thousands and thousands of African-American voters. Secondly, we wouldn't be having this debate today if we had a system of instant runoff voting in this country. Then Ralph Nader would pose no threat to the re-election of to the election of John Kerry. He would not be facilitating the election of George Bush, the most right-wing president that we've had. If we had instant runoff voting, we could have the kind of debates that Ralph wants, open debates, because minor parties, third parties wouldn't cause those problems. We need fundamental electoral change. I argue to you that we have a better chance of having that with John Kerry as president than we do with George Bush as president.
I would abolish the Electoral College. I think for the United States government to lecture people overseas about democracy and then turn around and say the man who got the lesser number of votes becomes president in 2000 than the person, Gore, who got more votes is a rather difficult position to uphold. I think it's also important to recognize it's the only way third parties have had leverage over the major party candidates is to deny them votes, is to say to them that for too long they have ignored the needs of the American people. They've had their chance. How many times did they flunk? How many times do they betray us? How many times do they disrespect the voter? How many times do they become more and more similar than they are different? I'm speaking of the Republican Democratic Party. You can have all the electoral reform if you want, but if you have vigorous citizens involved, informed voters involved to take back our country and our government, the reforms just will be overridden by the overwhelming power of commercial interests that have turned Washington into corporate-occupied territory.
We're going to go to another question, but just quickly, you both support instant runoff voting, both of you?
I do.
Yes, well, it's good to see how it works.
And as far as you, Governor Dean, do you support or oppose the end of the Electoral College?
I have never thought about that a lot, and the problem is that my state's a small state, and if you abolish the Electoral College, nobody would ever campaign there ever again. However, I think that Ralph's point is a good one. We don't need any more candidates elected President of the United States who have 500,000 fewer votes than the person they competed in. If that's what it takes, we'll do it.
Let's take another question here on Justice Talking.
Hi, Bob Wittick, Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, a few blocks from here, the Senate's debating a constitutional moment. They're trying to decide whether to enact a federal marriage amendment. What can either and both of you say today, send a message to the Senate to stop this constitutional train wreck?
This is exactly why I'm here. I'm not here because I dislike Ralph Nader, and I'm not here because I don't think he has the right to run for president. I think he does have that right. But I'm here to argue that under John Kerry, he has publicly said that he would not ever use the Constitution of the United States to take away rights from people. This will be the first time, should this succeed, that the Constitution of the United States has been used to remove people's rights. This is none of the business of the federal government. The Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional. This is outrageous. States ought to be able to decide for themselves. We decided, we were the first in the nation to decide that every single gay and lesbian American deserved the same rights as everybody else did. Massachusetts has now decided, let the states do this. The only role of the federal government should be this. One, they ought to make clear that every state has a responsibility in the way that they choose to make sure that every gay and lesbian American has the same rights as everybody else. And two, the President of the United States, as I have promised and I believe Senator Kerry has promised, should make available every single immigration right, taxation right, inheritance right, and all the other 1,600 rights that are not available now to gay and lesbian Americans because they're not allowed to get married. Those rights should be available to every American, every single American, without an adjective about what that American category for that American might belong to.
Thank you, Governor Dean. And now Ralph Nader.
Well, we believe in equal rights, and our position is much better than John Kerry's position. You can compare our positions by logging into our website, votenader.org. Without going into elaboration, the gay lesbian community would prefer our position to the opposition of John Kerry to what's going on in Massachusetts. Certainly his position is better than George W. Bush, but our position is the best. We've got to get rid of this discrimination, this chilling, this bigotry toward gays and lesbians that are reflected in literally hundreds of statutes and regulations in this country.
We have a question in the audience from a very successful independent third-party candidate, John Anderson.
Thank you. John Anderson of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and also of the Center for Voting and Democracy. I want to applaud both candidates for their endorsement of instant runoff voting. I would only hope, Governor Dean, that it will become part of the Democratic platform, a specific plank endorsing that and working in the states to make sure that state legislatures make that possible. The other point that I think should be made on electoral reform, again, I applaud Governor Dean for his willingness to debate Ralph Nader here today. But what about the coming general election campaign? Will you and the Democratic Party insist that we reform the present debate process, which has become the property of the so-called Commission on Presidential Debates, just another name for the two major parties? Would you accept the kind of reform in that area that would say that if a candidate has ballot access to the extent that he could win a majority in the Electoral College, if he has the qualifications that would be manifest by a national poll showing that at least half of the American voters in September would like to hear that candidate in the debates, will you support the inclusion of an open debate process that would give a third party or independent candidate the right to participate in those debates?
The way you asked the question is very interesting, because you also laid out a series of thresholds. I don't care who runs the debate. If you want somebody else to run this, if you think it's the property of the two parties, fine, let's give it to somebody else to run it. But there does have to be a threshold. Right now there is a threshold. It's 15% in the polls. Well, maybe that's not the right threshold. I just went through a primary where there were 9 candidates on the stage at the same time. That was not very enlightening to most voters. It was a good exercise.
And it was really interesting, right? I mean,
I thought it was incredibly dull, and most people I talked to did too.
I don't know. When I remember, when I looked at the debates and I saw, Al Sharpton and Carol Moseley Braun and you and Dennis Kucinich, I thought it was a lot more witty.